Hey, BassGeek here, and today we're going to talk about throwing jigs for wintertime bass. So let's talk about material of the jig. Now, I'm not talking about the skirt material. Yeah, there's times for different types of skirt material here and there. Generally, I'm a silicone guy, not a living rubber guy, because the silicone, to me, doesn't flare out quite as much as living rubber, and in clear water, I like that solid pattern a little more. Now, all that being said, really what I'm talking about is the material that the head's made out of. There's two types of material, lead or tungsten. The pros of tungsten, during the winter time, you're going to feel things a lot better. It's going to translate what's on the bottom. It's going to translate that bite. And the other thing about tungsten is its size. This is a 3/4 ounce tungsten, and this is a 3/4 ounce lead jig. So there's quite a bit of size difference from tungsten to the lead. And that's really why I prefer to go to it above all the other reasons, is the size. Again, you can see I fish steep, deep, clearer reservoirs. So a lot of the time when I'm out there fishing, I want a finesse style jig, and finesse for me means smaller, but it also means that 90% of the time the head that I'm going to be throwing is a football head. Now let's talk about the different sizes, shapes, whatever, to jig heads that I'm going to be throwing. Now, if you guys have seen my Jigs 101, you'll know realistically there's 5 different types of heads. Now there's a couple of variants out there, but they're basically 5 different types. Now, I'm not going to do a lot of flipping. If you're lucky enough and they don't draw down like they do on my lakes, sure, go ahead and pick up that arky style, go flipping, or if you're around weeds, pick up that bullet head, that flipping jig style head. But 90% of the time, I'm going to use the true ball head finesse, and I'm going to use the football. And the football is generally going to be the one that I go to. During the summertime, the big crawls are out. I want that size of the lead during the summer. Your bigger crawls are going to be out and they're going to be active. Most of the time, the crawls, especially under that 50-degree mark, that are going to be out and going to be a little more active are going to be your younger, smaller crawls. So I like to throw a smaller jig up until the spring, and in the spring I'll go back to lead once we get up to that 52, 53, 55 mark, because those big crawls will get a little more active and they'll begin to molt. So when we talk about the two different size heads, 90% of the time I am going to throw that football head jig. The round head jig, I'm going to throw it a lot of times when I'm around gravel. So really small rock mixed in with some of that mud. That's where those smaller crayfish, they're going to be able to burrow into that softer bottom. So don't knock if you get out on a point or on a hump and you've got some of that mud and just fine gravel or shale. That's a lot of times where I'm going to use that little ball head jig to target. Everywhere else is going to be a football head for me. Any type of rock, I mean, you can see tons of it here behind me. That bank right there actually would be perfect for a ball head jig if I was going to throw a ball head. Now, what you can't see out here to the side, but I'll show you in a minute, there's a ton of slate rock, really chunk rock, and a lot of times those are going to be the areas that I'm going to target with that football head. Now, that brings us to really what size. Generally, with the smaller heads, it's going to be an 1/8 ounce. So the ball head jigs, I'm going to go an 1/8, a quarter. generally I'm not fishing shallow and I'm wanting something that I can fish out deeper, that 1/8 ounce is sort of my go-to. With the football head, it's going to be 3/8, which is going to be very rare. Sometimes they just like that slower fall. 1/2 ounce, but most of the time my go-to is going to be that 3/4. That 3/4 ounce is going to be my go-to jig during the wintertime, because a lot of times I could cast it up in the 5-10 foot, but I'm going to drag it all the way off to as far as 30, 40, 50 feet deep. And that's sometimes where the bass are going to be holding as that comes off the side of a steep area or bluff. Ball heads. Now guys, I will throw them on a Baitcaster. I'll throw them on a softer, medium heavy, but a lot of times this right here is what I'm going to throw them on. By the way, if you guys haven't, make sure you follow that link, and there is a 10% discount in the bottom, in the description down there, so you get them 10% off. These things are worth it, and they're very worth it for you bank anglers. And the biggest reason why is this tip right here. You accidentally shove a tip into a tree, the bank, the parking lot, that tip will protect, and I am pushing. That is a very hard tip. So make sure you go pick up some of the TRC rod covers, guys. I use them. I broke 5 rods, literally getting rods and reels out of my boat just 2 years ago. And I carry a lot of reel, and I've got 2 rod lockers, and I've probably got 60 rods and reels combos in my boat right now. I've not broke a single rod all year long. Not a one, except fishing. And you know, it's kind of hard to use a rod cover when you're fishing. So I challenge TRC to fix that problem for me next. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, now 90% of the time, you know, I'm a Baitcaster guy. I'm going to throw it on my Baitcaster most of the time, those ball head jigs. But you can absolutely get away with throwing it on a 7-foot medium action to a medium heavy action. Depends on the rod make and how much backbone. Every rod, even every type of rod made by the same company is different. You want it to be a little stiffer, a little heavier, a little more backbone, you know, a nice fast tip. So medium to a medium heavy spinning combo to a fast action tip, okay? Now, 90% of the time, I'm going to throw it, because you're dragging it, I'm throwing 10-pound fluorocarbon on there, all right? In the wintertime, I think it's hugely important to use fluorocarbon. 10-pound fluoro, that's what I'm going to go with 90% of the time when I go with that true finesse, like the Bitsy Bug, something like that, that ball head jig type of jig. Now, when it comes to my football head jigs, I'm going to throw most of the time on a medium heavy fast action. This is my Killer Bass Baits Trident. This is my jig rod. This is my go-to. I'm going to cast this, and like I said, 90% of the time I'm going to throw that 3/4 ounce head. Okay, this rod works perfectly. It's a 7'3". You can go for a 7'3" fast action, medium heavy fast action. Now, if you have a little bit of trouble, you can go up to a heavy, but my opinion is get you a rod that's a little bit on the stiffer side as far as the tip goes. Go with a medium heavy fast action. You're dragging it, and a lot of times you're not in super heavy cover, so you can get away with this all day long. During the winter time, I like the scale line down, so even on the other one, even on the spinning rod, I may scale down to 8-pound test. That's about as low as I'll go on that. But on this, generally, again, it's going to be about 10 to 12-pound test during the winter time for me. Fluorocarbon, as always. So now let's talk about trailers for both of these. 90% of the time, guys, when the fish get a little more inactive, I'm going to throw my Moab. I'm going to cut it down. This is from Bass Munitions. It's a very do-nothing bait, you don't have a lot of flip, flutter, that's generally what I'm going to throw. The other thing is going to be a big salty chunk from Zoom. That's probably my other favorite thing to throw. For the finesse jig, I'm going to throw the small salty chunk by Zoom. Or Strike King makes the rodent in a 3-inch version, and that works great. Now, with the ball head jig, there's a retrieve that I like to do where I cast it out, especially on those long, kind of muddier points, where I'll just slowly reel it. I'll use a twin tail grub for that technique because I want just the tiniest amount of flutter. Now, let's talk about color. Guys, if you've seen my Jig 101 video or that whole playlist, you'll know when it comes to jig color, generally, I'm going to go with 5 different types. This time of year, fishing a jig the way I fish it this time of year, I'm really going to go with 3. It's going to be a brown, a green, or a black. Black and blue. So, green pumpkin, watermelon, black and blue. Now this is a 4th color that I like a lot, and that is my black, brown, amber. I put this skirt together myself. I love this color in stained water like we have right now. But generally, the 3 colors I mentioned before, a black, a brown, and a green, they'll work anywhere in the country. If they ain't biting one, pick up the other and go to throwing it. So this is perfect. You've got a transition from mud and pea gravel to big slate rock, back down to some chunk rock, and then to a bluff. Now when we talk about retrieve, guys, we've talked about retrieve 100 times. We're going to make that cast out there. We're going to point that rod tip at about a 9 o'clock position, and then we're just slowly going to drag, and I mean slowly during the winter time, going to drag that bait. Reel back down to it. Drag it. Sometimes I'll stop right in the middle of that drag. I'll pull it again. If I feel like I'm coming over some chunk rock, a lot of times I'll even sit there and just shake it a little bit. Let it kind of knock up against that just a little bit. That's going to be my retrieve. That's how I'm going to drag it. 90% of the time, that's the retrieve I'm going to make during the winter time. Now, like I said, with the ball head jig, I don't have one rigged up right now, so I'm going to show you something a little different. A lot of times, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that cast out there. I'm going to let that ball head jig hit the bottom. I'm going to hold that rod tip at about a 10 o'clock position. And I'm just going to reel it on the bottom in that mud. So I'm just going to slowly reel it, keep in contact with the bottom. Now again, this will be a lot of times on a spinning reel. You can do it on a casting rod and reel too. You know, you're probably going to throw that 1/4 ounce on a casting rod, but I'm just going to slowly reel it so that I'm touching bottom at all times. That's going to be the difference in making or in using the ball head jig. Other times when I'm using a ball head jig, I'm going to do the same exact thing I'm doing right here. Now guys, as I go down a bluff, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to start out by 45 in this bluff. And what that's going to tell me is it's going to tell me where those fish are, how deep they are. It's going to tell me how deep those fish are. And then at that point, I can pull the boat in and I can look at my map on my front graph and I can absolutely tell where I'm casting, and I can stay on that depth level so that I'm making the most out of those casts. The thing about bluff fishing too, these spots like this where you got a little bit of a rock slide, then you've got your hard rock right there, you want to really target those areas because that makes a natural ambush point. That really does cover jig fishing in the wintertime for me. One thing I will tell you, one extra bit of advice I'll give you, you need to fish fast but slow. What I mean by that is cover a lot of spots. But while you're on those spots, 2, 3, 4, 5 casts, fish them slow. So don't spend all day picking apart one spot until you get them figured out. Find the high percentage areas. When you get there, fish the jig slow. When you get bites, you'll know what other places to look for. All right, as always, I hope this helps you go out and catch some big wintertime bass on this jig. I'm telling you, the wintertime is the right time to throw a jig around. Like I said, scale down. I love going to tungsten this time of year. There's a right time and right place for everything, and lead is the right time and right place a lot of times in the summertime. But this time of year, tungsten is your friend. So go out and get some of those tungsten jigs. They're just so much smaller. All right. As always, questions and comments in the comments section below. You guys know I love to talk about fishing with you. Like it if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. Make sure you ring that bell, and you, oh yeah, baby, you guys rock.